The dark side of being a good person. Carl Jung observed that the brighter the picture a person paints of themselves, the more stubbornly the unconscious insists on painting the rest of the canvas somewhere out of sight. Here is the premise, and I want you to sit with it before we go any further. Jung wrote in Ion, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." And he was not being poetic for its own sake. He meant it as a clinical observation. The very height of a person's ideals is purchased, root for root, by a corresponding depth of what that person cannot look at. So if you have ever wondered why the kindest people you know sometimes carry the heaviest silence, or why the ones who never raise their voice seem to hum with something unspoken underneath, this is why. The tree cannot have it both ways. It either grows honestly, roots and branches both, or it grows only upward, thin and overextended, until the first hard wind finds it. Jung would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The goodness you are so careful to maintain is not the opposite of your shadow. It is the very thing that is feeding it." So let us be honest with ourselves for a moment. In my own life, I say, there are days I have been polite instead of honest, agreeable instead of true, generous in public and resentful in private. And I have called this being good, when it was closer to being careful. So I say to myself, I see the goodness I perform, and I ask what it is standing guard over. I see the parts of myself I have exiled, in order to be liked, and I welcome them back, without needing them to apologize first. Say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. Again, I make the unconscious conscious. If this is landing somewhere in you, subscribe so that tomorrow's teaching finds you the same way this one did. Before we go further, type the words "face it" in the comments. Just those 2 words. Let it be a small, honest mark that something in you recognized itself tonight. Come. The first key is that goodness and the absence of a shadow are not the same thing. And mistaking one for the other is the whole trap. You can be a genuinely kind person and still be dragging behind you a shadow that has never once been examined. Because the shadow is not measured by how bad you are, it is measured by how much of yourself you have refused to look at. And refusal has nothing to do with virtue. Jung put this plainly. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Read that again slowly. The less it is embodied, the blacker and denser it is, which means the good person who has never once admitted to cruelty, envy, laziness, or rage is not free of these things. They have simply pushed them into a room they never enter, and a room that is never entered does not stay empty, it fills. Quietly, with everything that was never allowed to be lived in the light. Imagine the woman everyone in her circle calls the reliable one, the one who remembers birthdays, who shows up early, who has never once, in 15 years of friendship, said an unkind word about anyone in the group. She wears this reputation the way some people wear a favorite coat, and she has come to believe it is simply her nature. But Jung would ask a quieter question, not whether she is unkind, but whether unkindness has ever once been permitted to exist in her at all, even for a moment, even privately. Because if the answer is no, if 15 years have produced not one uncharitable thought worth admitting, that is not evidence of a spotless character. It is evidence of a room that has been kept locked the entire time. So the very discipline that makes you appear so consistently good, the vigilance, the self-control, the constant editing of your own reactions, is also the discipline that is deepening the room on the other side of the wall. This is not a reason to abandon your goodness. It is a reason to stop mistaking it for wholeness. A polished surface is not the same as a solved problem, and a person who has never lost their temper in 30 years has not transcended anger. They have only found a very good hiding place for it. Ask yourself honestly which rooms in your own house you have agreed, quietly and long ago, never to open. I do not need a perfect image to be good. The second key is that the good person's forbidden feelings do not disappear. They go underground and wait. And this is where the trouble usually begins. Imagine a man who has never once, in his adult life, raised his voice. His family calls him the gentle one. His co-workers call him easy to work with. He prides himself, quietly, on never losing control, and for years, this seems to be simply who he is. But Jung would ask, where did the anger go? Because anger is a normal human reaction to being wronged. It does not vanish because a man decides he is above it. It goes somewhere. And in this composite case, it goes into small, strange places. A coldness that appears without explanation. A headache that arrives every time he is asked to compromise. An irritation with his children that seems wildly out of proportion to whatever they actually did. He calls these moods, he does not call them anger, because in his conscious mind he does not have anger. He only has moods. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The shadow is blacker and denser, the less it is embodied." The anger this man refuses to feel does not become smaller for being refused. It becomes shapeless, and shapeless anger is far more dangerous than anger with a name. Because a named feeling can be reasoned with. A nameless one simply leaks into the wrong rooms, at the wrong people, at the wrong times. Follow this same man a little further, and you begin to see the pattern spread. He is short with the waiter, over a mistake that would not have bothered him 10 years ago. He finds himself replaying an old argument at 2 in the morning. Inventing sharper things he should have said, he notices, with some confusion, that he has started avoiding a particular friend, and cannot say exactly why, only that something about that friendship leaves him unsettled. None of this registers to him as anger, because he has already decided, long ago, that he is not an angry man. So each new symptom gets a different name. He is tired. He is stressed. He is simply not himself lately. But Jung would say these are the same feeling wearing different coats. The emotion has not disappeared. It has only lost its address. And a feeling without an address will eventually knock on whatever door is nearest. Often the door of someone who did nothing to deserve it. His child, his partner, a stranger who cut him off in traffic. This is the quiet cost of a lifetime spent being the gentle one. Not that the anger was wrong to refuse, but that refusing it did not make it obedient. It only made it homeless. The good person is often not the person with the fewest dark feelings, but the person with the least practice, recognizing them when they surface. And this is worth sitting with, because it means the very self-image of gentleness can become the thing standing in the way of an honest life. Notice this week where your own moods arrive without a clear cause, and ask, gently, what feeling might be wearing that mood as a disguise? I let my anger have a name before it has a victim. The third key is that maintaining a good image costs something. Every single day, whether or not you ever notice the bill, and I want you to think of this quite literally, as a ledger, because that is closer to how the unconscious actually keeps score than any moral language we usually reach for. So let us walk through an ordinary Tuesday, not a dramatic one, just an ordinary one, the kind you have lived 100 times, 7 in the morning. Someone at breakfast says something careless, and you feel the flare of irritation, but you swallow it, because good people do not snap at breakfast. 9 in the morning, a colleague takes credit for something you did, and you feel the sting of it, but you let it go, because good people are not petty. Noon, a friend cancels on you for the 3rd time, and something in you goes cold, but you say it is fine, because good people are understanding. 3 in the afternoon, you are asked to do more than your share, again, and you say yes, again, because good people are helpful. 5 in the evening, someone cuts in front of you in traffic, and your whole body tightens with an anger that has nowhere sanctioned to go, so you breathe it down and call it nothing. 6 in the evening, you come home tired in a way that has no clear cause, and you cannot explain to yourself why a day with no real disasters in it has left you feeling so hollow. Notice that not one of these moments, on its own, was large enough to justify a scene, and that is exactly the trick of it. None of them were ever going to be the one that broke the surface, and so none of them were ever paid. They were absorbed instead, filed quietly in the same unlit room, and a ledger that is only ever added to, never settled, does not stay small. It compounds, the way a debt compounds. silently, in the background, while the person carrying it goes on believing they owe nothing at all. Now imagine a woman who has done this for 20 years. Everyone who knows her calls her endlessly patient. She has built a whole identity on being the one who does not make a fuss, and by any outward measure she has succeeded. But she has also noticed, only in the last year or two, a strange flatness that arrives some evenings for no reason she can name, and an impatience with small things, a dropped dish, a slow line at the store, that seems wildly out of scale with what actually happened. Jung would say she is not becoming a worse person, she is simply receiving, late and in the wrong currency, the interest on 20 years of unpaid feeling. This is what he meant by unlived life, not the dramatic kind, the loud regret over a life not taken, but this smaller, daily kind, ordinary true feelings that were never once permitted to exist out loud. And unlived life does not evaporate simply because it was never spoken. It accumulates in exactly the place you have agreed never to look, which is why so many genuinely kind people report an exhaustion they cannot account for, and a private bitterness that seems to contradict everything they sincerely believe about themselves. They are not hypocrites, and they are not secretly bad. They are simply carrying a balance that was never once brought into the light to be settled honestly. So pause for a moment and pick one real day this week, not a story you tell about yourself, an actual day, and count, as plainly as you can, how many times you swallowed something true in order to remain someone's idea of good. That number is not a failure, it is information. It is the ledger finally being read out loud instead of left to run in silence, and information, once you actually have it, can be worked with, in a way that a vague, formless tiredness never can. I notice the toll before it comes due. The fourth key comes from Jung's own life, and I find it steadies people every time they hear it. Jung recalled a dream from his later years. In it, he was walking at night, along a narrow path in a fierce wind, carrying a small lantern that he had to shield with both hands to keep it lit. And behind him, cast by his own light, walked an enormous shadow. At first the dream unsettled him, but he came to understand it plainly. The lantern was his own small, hard-won consciousness, the light he had built through years of honest self-examination, and the great shadow following him was not a punishment. It was simply what any true light casts. The brighter and steadier the lantern, the larger the shadow it throws behind. This is the piece that so many good people never hear. Having a shadow is not evidence that something has gone wrong with your character. It is evidence that you are carrying a light at all. A person with no shadow is not a saint. They are someone standing in the dark. Now imagine a woman who has spent 30 years as the reliable one, the one who shows up early, who never complains, who has built a whole life around being someone others can lean on. And one evening, driving home after an ordinary shift, she feels a wave of something close to bitterness, sharp and unwelcome, and it frightens her more than it should, because in her mind, a person like her is not supposed to feel that. She has spent so long polishing the lantern that the shadow catches her by surprise, as though it arrived from nowhere. But it did not arrive from nowhere. It has been walking behind her the entire time, matching her step for step, growing exactly as tall as the light she worked so hard to keep burning. This is worth saying to her, and to you. The wind was always going to blow. The path was always going to be dark. The shadow was never a sign that her lantern had failed. It was proof that her lantern had been lit at all. So the task was never to arrive at a life with no shadow trailing behind it. That road does not exist for anyone. The task was only ever to keep walking, hands cupped around the flame, shadow acknowledged rather than denied, rather than spending her remaining strength pretending the wind is not blowing and the shape behind her is not there. A lantern that has never cast a shadow was never really lit. It was only ever imagined. I carry my lantern without denying its shadow. If any of this feels like it is reaching something real in you, consider subscribing, so the next piece of this teaching arrives when you need it. It costs you nothing, and it keeps the fire lit between us. The fifth key is the deepest one. and I want to open it slowly, in pieces, because it is the one most good people resist the longest. First, consider what Jung meant by moral effort. He wrote in Ion that becoming conscious of the shadow requires considerable moral effort, and notice the word he chose, not insight, not a nice afternoon of reflection. Effort, moral effort. Because facing your own shadow is not like solving a puzzle, it is like admitting under oath something you would rather not admit, and for the good person, this is uniquely hard, because their entire self-concept has been built on being the kind of person who would never do such a thing. So to look honestly at the resentment, the pettiness, the small cruelties, the moments of cowardice dressed up as patience, is to threaten the very identity that has made them feel safe and worthy for years. This is why good people so often defend their shadow more fiercely than anyone else, not because they have more to hide, but because they have more invested in the story that there is nothing there. The moral effort is not the effort of becoming better, it is the far stranger effort of admitting you were never quite as finished as you believed. Second, consider what happens when this effort is refused. Jung taught that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate, and this is precisely what tends to happen to the good person who will not look inward. The anger they refuse to own finds its way out anyway, in outbursts that shock everyone, including themselves, in illnesses of temper that arrive without warning, in relationships that mysteriously sour around them while they remain, in their own account, entirely blameless, or it comes out sideways, as an unusually harsh judgment of someone else's small failing, a judgment far more intense than the offense could possibly justify. This disproportion is always a clue. When your reaction to someone else's flaw is larger than the flaw itself, some of what you are reacting to is not really out there at all. It has slipped out from the room you never enter, and it has found, for a moment, a face to wear that is not your own. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, and this line matters enormously here, because the good person has usually spent their whole life imagining figures of light, cultivating the image, polishing the persona, and calling that the work, when the actual work, the harder and far less flattering work, was always in the other room. Third, let me give this some flesh. Because it is easy to nod along with an idea like this and still not feel it. So imagine a woman everyone in her family calls the reliable one. She has held this title for 20 years. She remembers birthdays. She drives the elderly neighbor to appointments. She is the one who stays calm when everyone else is falling apart. And she has never once, in living memory, been the source of the family's trouble. She has built a whole identity on this, quietly, without ever naming it. And one ordinary Sunday, at a family dinner, her sister forgets to thank her for something small, a favor, nothing really, and this reliable woman finds herself, to her own genuine shock, fighting back tears at the table over something that, said out loud, sounds almost embarrassingly minor. She goes home and cannot explain it to herself. She was not even that hurt by the forgotten thank you, so why did it land like a wound? Jung would say the wound was never really about the thank you. The forgotten gratitude simply found the door of an old, unguarded room, a room where 20 years of unacknowledged effort, unspoken resentment, and a quiet, unmet hunger to be truly seen had been accumulating. Unnamed, because naming it would have meant admitting she was not only the reliable one, she was also tired, also wanting, also, at moments, quietly furious at how much she gave without asking. This is not a flaw in her character. It is simply what happens when a whole category of true feeling is never given a room of its own in the light. It does not disappear, it waits by the door, and it opens at the smallest excuse. Fourth, and this is the piece that finally offers some relief, the shadow uncovered is very rarely as monstrous as the good person fears. This is worth saying plainly, because the fear of looking is almost always worse than what is actually found. Most of what lives in that unlit room is not evil, it is simply unlived. ordinary human material that was never given permission to exist, the sharp word you never said, the boundary you never held, the desire you judged yourself for feeling, the rest you never allowed yourself to take. None of this makes you a bad person. It makes you a human one, and there is a real difference between a shadow that is monstrous and a shadow that is merely unacknowledged. Most good people, when they finally look, do not find a villain. They find someone tired, someone who has been performing for so long they forgot there was another way to live. So here is a practice worth actually doing this week. Take a page, and at the top write the words, "Not like me," and underneath, honestly, list the qualities you find distasteful in other people. The ones that make you flinch a little when you see them: laziness, arrogance, neediness, cruelty, whatever comes. Then, for each one, ask quietly whether you have ever, even once, in a small unguarded moment, been exactly that. Not permanently, not as your whole character, just once. This is not an exercise in guilt, it is an exercise in honesty, and honesty, done this way, tends to feel less like collapse and more like relief, because the energy it takes to keep a whole category of human experience permanently exiled from yourself is enormous, and most people who do this exercise report feeling lighter afterward, not worse, because the shadow, once given a small amount of daylight, generally stops needing to run the whole house from the basement. The reliable woman at that dinner table was never the exception. She is nearly everyone who has spent a life being praised for what they never let themselves feel. I make my darkness a companion, not a stranger. The sixth key is the gentlest one, and it is where all of this finally comes to rest. Integrating your shadow does not make you a worse person. It makes your goodness real instead of performed. This is the part that frightens people before they try it, and comforts them completely once they have. They imagine that looking at their pettiness, their envy, their capacity for coldness, will somehow turn them into someone cruel, but the opposite tends to happen. A goodness that has faced its own shadow is sturdier than a goodness that has never been tested, because it is no longer a performance being protected at all costs. It is simply how the person has come to live, having done the harder, quieter work of knowing what they are also capable of. Imagine a woman who has spent 30 years being the one everyone leans on, the one who remembers birthdays, who shows up with soup, who never once says no when she is asked for help. And one evening a friend, in the middle of an ordinary conversation, gently points out that she seems tired lately, and something in her, to her own surprise, flares hot and defensive. She goes home unsettled, not because the comment was cruel, it was not, but because some small, honest part of her had been waiting years for permission to admit she was tired, and that flare was not a flaw in her goodness. It was her goodness finally telling the truth. If she had turned away from that flare, called it an overreaction, and buried it again, nothing would have changed. But she sits with it instead, and asks what the tiredness has been carrying all this time, and slowly, her kindness stops being a debt she pays, and becomes something she actually chooses each morning. This is the whole difference. A goodness that has never been allowed to feel its own limits is brittle. A goodness that has met its own resentment, its own exhaustion, its own occasional wish to be left alone, and made room for these things anyway, is no longer fragile. It can bend without breaking, because it is no longer holding up an image, it is simply holding up a life. This is not a small distinction. A person who has never examined their own capacity for anger will be at the mercy of it the day it finally surfaces. But a person who has met that capacity honestly, named it, held it, can meet the same moment with far more choice. This is what Jung meant when he said the meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. Notice the word first. It is not the end of the road, it is the doorway, and everyone who has ever done any real inner work has had to walk through that same doorway. There is no version of becoming whole that skips it, and there is no shortcut through it either. You cannot think your way past it, or affirm your way around it. You can only walk through, slowly, on ordinary days, one honest look at a time. So if you have spent years quietly afraid that looking honestly at yourself would reveal something unforgivable, I want to leave you with this. It will more likely reveal something simply human, tired, unfinished, and entirely capable of being welcomed home. My goodness includes what I once denied. Here is the whole picture. The brighter the image, the denser the shadow behind it. The feelings you refuse do not vanish. They go underground and wait. Every swallowed reaction is a small debt that compounds without your noticing. The light you carry will always cast a shadow, and that shadow is proof of the light, not a failure of it. Facing the shadow takes real moral effort, but what waits there is rarely a monster. Usually, it is only the unlived parts of an ordinary life. And once faced, your goodness stops being a performance and becomes something you can actually stand on. These were never 6 separate lessons. They were 6 turns of the same single key. And that key is this: wholeness was never about having no darkness. It was always about no longer needing to hide from it. There is no product at the end of this, no offer, only the teaching itself, and the teaching is enough. If you have spent your life being called good and have quietly wondered what that goodness was costing you, you are not the only one. Jung spent decades of his own life turning back toward exactly this question, and he never claimed to arrive at some final purified version of himself, only a more honest one. And that, in the end, is what individuation actually asks of any of us. Not perfection, but honesty about the whole of what we are, the light, and what stands behind it both. And so I say it once more, I make the unconscious conscious, and I leave you with the question, underneath the title of this very video, if being good and being whole are not the same thing, which one, quietly, have you actually been choosing?